Hey everybody, it's your buddy Beard Grizzly, and I don't have a lot of bandwidth for this one, meaning let's get into it. As always, keep in mind this is opinion. Also, apologies ahead of time, as I'm sure the edits are going to be a little light on this one, as well as also my throat, because I'm still not feeling the greatest, and now I have a small cyst in my hand that I need to watch. Lovely. Anyway, let's move on. I'm really tired of books like Truth to Power. We've gotten 4 books that go along this line of thinking, which includes Unveiling, the new book from Shadowkeep, the chronicon, Truth to Power, as mentioned, and also Books of Sorrow. Now, before you get the pitchforks out, Books of Sorrow is definitely to a lesser degree. This could be my bias talking in that respect, since it was the first that we really walked down that path. It was the first time we were introduced to something like that. It was also the first time we saw some narrative way outside that of Earth and humanity, so it has a special place for all of us, I think. Today, in a destiny that is attempting to bring some lines together, the last thing we need is more haze, and that's precisely what the books of Unveiling and Truth to Power seek to do. Chronicon is something else. No, that's not a compliment, Callus. Stop it. Now, I talked about Truth to Power to a lesser degree in a community post, as well as poked fun at it in other videos, but I never fully went into it. Being that the information within it is largely unnecessary, here's the TLDR version. You are given messages by an entity in the Dreaming City. They seem to be attached to equipment or otherwise that we receive from the Queen in our adventures into the Dreaming City, and especially only on week 3 of the curse. Not that that matters much per this point, I suppose, and that's just a waking nightmare for all of us, no pun intended. We take twists and turns within this book, starting with Eris Morn seemingly telling us she knows about her past and how she died while on a swimming venture. Then we're introduced to an AI called Medusa, which gets abducted by the Vex or something, which we find is Korea Blade Transform, Korea, whatever. The same one we hear of being turned over to Savathun in the Books of Sorrow. Then we choose our own adventure, and it all goes backwards after a visit from Savathun's daughter, Dolan Karu. She spews some nonsense at us, which also turns out to be false. In the page, "You must," she says the following. "Now you have received my mother's message," she says, "but I must admit it is all a fabrication. I have written it hoping to know my mother, to capture her true motives, to speculate upon her designs, is the greatest worship." And from this moment on with the book, everything, absolutely anything that it could tell us, needs to be known for what it is. Incomplete bias, with no factual information scattered amongst all of it. I think it was after this page I didn't even log into Destiny for about a month or so. I had seen what I expected it to be. Fabrication and a waste of time. And for it being a video game, which already wastes time, realistically, yeah, I think that kind of drives the point home. Useless information. A way to make sure we logged in every month, at least, and keep those numbers up for then Activision Blizzard and the concurrent logins for users. At least the cynical side of me really said anyway. I know that's not the developer's intentions. But when the book plays out and ends with Eris Morn still trying to convince us that it's her at the end of all things, at the end of this book at least, well, it just loses all its punch. This book spreads, or attempts to spread, a load of bad information. In some cases, that's precisely what we can suspect from the Witch Queen herself, sure, and that's exactly what Dolan Karu meant by trying to understand her mother's designs. But it could have been summed up in a better package, left to us with a couple entries almost similar to the ones in the web lore we received about Nokris before Warmind, or the 3 entries of the Hive items we received from Warmind as well. But how it could have done better isn't really the point. It's the information presented to us that is. Now, thankfully, I don't see a lot of this information from any of the books I mentioned, save Books of Sorrow with good reason, being referenced at all. It seems many have at least figured it as suspect information. That's good, but it doesn't stop the trend. Also, on the note of Books of Sorrow and us referencing it and so on, it's because there's a lot of back information that we've now received that makes it a little bit more believable, even if it is more religious text of the Hive and so on. even then previously, it held the same general principles as what we found with Unveiling and Truth to Power, but there is something about these books that's very different. It's really hard for me to explain past that, but these books especially, it feels very, very different from Books of Sorrow. In information collection, you have to be able to weed out what is and isn't speculation within that information. In reality, any kind of collection paths you go down, you have to do this. Eventually, you'll find some relative angle and point of truth, but you're always going to miss some piece of information that could alter perspective and understanding of something entirely. I can't claim to know the entirety of time and space, let alone this small pebble of a rock I call Earth and the entire history upon it. We work as a collective to hopefully understand that information a bit better together as a species, each of us interested in our own little piece of history, or at least part of the globe. The information superhighway of the internet makes that both good and staunchly bad for those looking to abuse this power of fabrication. Your truths can be your own. Perspective is reality. That doesn't make them true to the whole. We each focus on something, a major, if you will, and some of us are lucky enough to be able to multitask, to handle more than one thing. Sometimes those things link, and interests come together, like a historian that's also a paleontologist. At the risk of sounding too vague, philosophical, and discussing real-world garbage, let's get back to Destiny to explain what I mean. The chronicon is another very good example of this information gathering, but here it's put in plain sight for why it's absolute trash. The idea of having information written ahead of time and us having to take it as fact. If that doesn't sound silly to you, then I don't know what does or will. Especially in a game that is all about timelines and bouncing from plane of existences to another within the lore, and really to a point within the game, not so much in our game world, of course. That would be very difficult, says the Guardian that goes through the corridors of time. Okay, maybe not so difficult. Think back on the conversations we've had about the Stranger recently. Think on how she is back and forth through different world lines. Callus and his scions have the ability to see into the future. A future, I should say. And that's the important piece. We've no idea if that's what will truly happen. We're meant to take it on faith that this is what and where we're supposed to go. And again, it's just not true. It's not factually true. It's faithfully true. And there's a very big difference there. And it's consistently said, Guardians make their own fate, their destiny. It's pretty well the name of the game. Also, Kratos called. He let me know he killed the Sisters of Fate about 2,800 years ago or so. Thanks, Kratos, you're a pal. Though that was meant as a joke, there is a line of serious thinking you could go down with that angle, possibly going with the last piece of it all today, Unveiling. The idea of the gods. I don't even know what I call these things. This idea of light and dark. Also, chicken and the egg conversations and about theology are had, like who created the gods and so on. Yeah, this gets murky really fast. The light and the dark as personified by something which gives us understanding, I suppose. There is no garden, there is no water, there is no seed, there is no flower. It's all a metaphor. A metaphor which it, or they, or whatever, tries to convey to us. It tries to tell us what and why Oryx followed it. Or is it even the same thing? Is it just Eris telling us some sort of scripture she's thought up while putting some pieces together from the Books of Sorrow and helping us put together Touch of Malice and the past ideas of our history with the shoemaker and so on, which that actually is a real thing if you guys decide to look it up. We don't have a ton to go by with this voice and the ending of the book. The unveiling per the end throws it all into question. The last entry is from Eris herself. I'll take an excerpt from it to illustrate my point. I think a world of balance would fight the darkness, because darkness unchecked is darkness thriving. I think that a world of balance would never mistake the excitement of transgression or the grim necessity of trespass for a genuinely righteous act. We must remember the value of unshakable, irrational hope. The choice to act as if we lived in a better world can create a place for that better world to exist. This is Eris's perspective. This is her writing things out for us in hopes of better understanding most of the moments and pieces we've seen so far within Unveiling, as well as what we've fought so far. They ring the same as they did from her experiences in the Hellmouth and her time in whatever space she was in prior to meeting the Queen again and going in their adventures or whatever they did out in space. Also, getting back to that idea of the philosopher and so on, that's basically what he wrote. It was the ideas that, light and dark and so on, and being irrationally hopeful, and just all of it is perceived as this idea that Eris actually just wrote the book, even if it's something that she was able to pick up on from bits and pieces from other history, etc. It doesn't ring as being from the artifact that we recovered in the pyramid at all. And quite frankly, anybody can pick up a history book and read that, so there you go. It's also a Wikipedia page. There is. I looked it up. This book can be, and to my opinion, is entirely undermined by finishing with the entry from Eris. It is undermined by it being a perspective that is centered around one figure I have little to no information on per the point in time that we're at, with all tellings being from the Books of Sorrow that already have questionable merit, from the single vision I had in the pyramid that uses the same general powers of the nightmares as perhaps what I would use in my ghost that speaks throughout someone tainted by darkness. No matter what else you may think of Eris, that much is true, and she's said so herself. I will not be spending time in these books any farther, save for a topic that may or may not happen because I'm a bit nervous of sensitive thoughts spilling over. Actually, that gives me more reason to do it. What am I saying? And maybe the chronicon, but that's for different reasons, and I might not even have time for that project. I see little to no information, true information, to tap into with these books, now that I've fully read them and fully comprehend them. I know I've covered the idea of the flower game previously, but I will stress, the ideas that are presented there are built of life and generalities. They also have more to do with the Vex, a species that centers on technology and computing and logic more than much else, and not the philosophies of the darkness, though you could argue it has more to do with the light than the dark. But anyway, and just to drive the point home, the flower game is something that's real and something that is accessible to us and also accessible to Eris, so the thought is there that it's again just written by Eris. Moving on. Until we have more information on these books and maybe have more truths that could be related back to these books, I don't see them as being worth much of our time, much of your time. They seek to muddy the waters more than they do actually tell us anything of value. In a universe of already muddied waters, I find that to be a very tough sell. But of course, we said the same of Toland and some of the stuff he said to us, which has become very much a truth. I guess in some ways it goes back to a good old-fashioned saying, be careful which philosophers you trust. This is not to say that perspective isn't something that Destiny uses to a rather large degree. It does. I talk about that often, in fact, and some perspectives are worth talking of, as they have a point in fact. For instance, think on the tale that Shin Malfur tells us on Dredge and Yor, and how his story twisted and turned with time. Think of how he interpreted that piece, especially early on. There is a layer of fact that is there that's far from the philosophical ramblings of an entity that exists because it exists. There is some truth and merit because of the events that happened, and they're easily traced back and easily found even in Vanguard history. And on this entity, to exist to begin with is the point of the light, and the gardener has already won, winnower, purely because you exist. How hypocritical of you. There is one thing that falls in line with all of the religious babble that we hear in Destiny. None of it holds a line of truth. It is barred on faith and hopes you have the faith to grasp it. that you dig yourself into it, that you think on the books of sorrow further, that you really lodge yourself in sword logic, that you really think about the salvation and convergence theory and so on of the Vex, that you really dig into what the winnower is selling you. Because if you do, you give in. I, as someone that's done far too much research into theology, spit at that ideal. But that's also the idea of perspective and personal journey, of which we are all on one and we're all at different places within them. It's a dangerous line that I know the writers tread when they are writing any path of this story. But with Unveiling, Truth to Power, and the Chronicon especially, they downright lie to us. I think it's still important to have and understand that lie. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here making this piece to begin with, of my opinion of pieces of lore within a game that I do not know the direction of. But I hope, in some ways, it helps you to see through a mist that may have been there for these pieces that you lacked before. A light in the dark, if you'll allow me the overused relation, though fitting. I think that's where I'll leave things, so thank you guys for letting me get this off my chest and just warm up a bit, since I know my content hasn't been rolling like I would like it to, especially not with feeling the greatest, and like I said, having this stupid system I hand, which I think actually I'm going to blame Day of the Spider for, because it's exactly where I would expect it to be. Halfway through the month already, and it's just been a lot slower than I expected. Anyway, if you have anything you'd like to say about this piece, you know where you can down below. I'll give your comments a read over, and hopefully we'll have some fun discussions. Otherwise, you know the buttons to press to at least tell me what you thought of this opinion piece. And before anyone says it, no, this is not an attack on any writers whatsoever. I think the writing in all of these books is great. It just doesn't really have much to do with Destiny at all. To all of you, no matter when or where you are, I'll see you next space time. Take care.